at the University of Washington, Tacoma campus. He's the author of The Politics of Annihilation, A Genealogy of Genocide. His research and teaching focuses on global politics, particularly armed conflict, genocide, and international law. He teaches classes on political violence, human rights, and international theory. Professor Meiches actually graduated from Whitman College here in Washington State and was conferred with his doctorate in political science in 2015 from Johns Hopkins University. Professor Meiches, thank you very much for joining us this evening. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Karen. Let me begin by just extending my thanks to the entire Olympia World Affairs Council and for everyone gathered here. I was humbled to receive this invitation to come and speak to you. I've done a little work with the Tacoma World Affairs Council in the past, and so I think there's an incredible value in the kinds of public intellectualism that this organization is sponsoring, and I just appreciate the offer and opportunity to be here and share kind of my insights and research with everyone. And special thanks to Nina Carter as well, who helped me through the process and figure out what I was doing and where I needed to be and everything. She's been spectacular, so I appreciate that. And lastly, let me begin with an apology. I began teaching Zoom classes this morning at 8:30 and didn't stop until 1 p.m. So there's a chance that I will lose my voice in the middle of this talk. I've been doing a lot on Zoom speaking to audiences already today. So just be forewarned if it starts to go, I apologize for that. And without any further ado, I'm going to share my screen with you. You should be able to see that. And I'm talking to you tonight about the history of genocide and the impact on atrocity prevention, especially today, humanitarian intervention. And I wanted to just kind of begin to situate or contextualize the research I'm going to share with you with some of the images that we might strongly associate when we think about genocide. Okay, so for instance, you may consider events like the discussions at the United Nations and determinations of when a genocide is happening that involve high-profile political elites and figures responding to situations of moral catastrophe. You might think about the United States' somewhat vexed history and contemporary history with respect to responding to genocide. Probably most infamously was the Clinton administration's decision to parse in its coverage in response to the events that became the Rwandan genocide, the concept of genocide into what the press secretary called acts of genocide, as a way of trying to disavow any responsibility under international law to more robustly intervene to prevent the mass slaughter of Tutsis and many Hutus and Twa as well. We often also think about the perpetrators of genocide, and we do so within, and reasonably so, with moral frameworks surrounding the evil and the sort of unthinkable actions that they undertake, and the way in which those events have almost a stinging resonance, that they stay with us and carry a powerful legacy moving forward. Trying to grapple with that as an element of the human experience has spawned all kinds of writings and questions. There are also very practical ways with which we interact actually with genocide in public space. Well, this is in France. I would wager that many people in the room have probably at least once in their lives gone to a genocide memorial, participated in some kind of acknowledgement or recognition of genocide, perhaps visited a Holocaust-oriented museum or site once, because we now have institutions that help us to guide thinking about genocide. And those are all really important elements of the way in which we as a society kind of connect with this idea. There are also occasions with which we see the term genocide and the idea of genocide pop up in ways that maybe catch us a little off guard. So this is a lovely book by Dr. Joel Furman, obviously entitled Fast Food Genocide, whose snappy title is designed to try to bring the reader in, to direct their attention, to get kind of notes to warn us about the dangers of saturated fats and simple carbohydrates and sugars. And while I agree with the good doctor that there's an importance in health, it signals that there's been obviously some significant deviation in the way that we politically, but also culturally relate to this idea of genocide. And actually, if we look at the data, that's fairly well borne out. Right? So this is Google Ngram data, which surveys the number of times that a word appears in all of the texts that Google Books has aggregated over a period of time. And what you can see here pretty clearly is that in the past 30 or 40 years, the concept of genocide has significantly risen, the amount that we use it and refer to it, in parallel with a much more significant rise in the way we talk about human rights, right? Whereas I put there, for purpose of contrast, say fascism, which is the period, obviously, when the concept of genocide gets created, and we'll talk about that in greater depth in a moment, we haven't seen that term used as much. I thought, just to be a little bit coy, and because of the unusual circumstances, I would even further show that there were some interesting patterns in the data of use by comparing it to Zoom, since I assumed that now that we're all on the Zoom platform, there would be a lot more books and publications with the term Zoom in it. It turns out that's not accurate. But we do see some specific rises in the mention and response to the problem of genocide. And if you note this, there's a blip following the kind of late to mid 1940s where we would see a lot of use. Then there's a rise again in the mid 1970s, and then beginning in the 1990s to the present, there's a significant rise in the references to this term and the regularity with which all manner of print and media are talking about. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do is to explain the history of this idea as a legal concept, and a little bit why and how these different bursts of public attention have happened, and how it has correspondingly shaped what we envision humanitarian intervention to involve, and created new policies, but also new obstacles to more progressive action to stop mass violence as a global problem, okay? And in general, I'm going to start and focus a lot on this early period in the 1940s when the international laws surrounding genocide were first crafted, and give you a lot of background information about the stakes, forces, and interests that were ongoing at that point in time. And then try to explain from there why this much larger launch of interest and concern about the problem of genocide inherited, in some ways, a very problematic reading of international law, which has in many ways hamstrung atrocity prevention. So I know that one of the things that brought the organization to me as a scholar who was interested in this area was the ongoing violence against the Rohingya in Myanmar. There are obviously many other occasions of mass violence. Part of my contribution, and what I'm hoping to illuminate for you tonight a little bit, is to explain why some pretty difficult elements of even our own society have in some ways undermined our ability to respond to these events with more rigor and political force. So that's where we're going to start tonight and try to get to the end. If we ever talk about genocide and its history, we're going to talk about this guy. This is Raphael Lemkin. He was a Polish Jewish jurist, and he is actually the person who coined the term genocide. And we have pretty good notes of that. There is no cognate term to genocide anywhere else in the literature until he developed it in 1943. And it's worth spending a minute or two kind of spelling out his biography, because he is both a fascinating character, a major advocate, and if you've ever read anything about the history of American responses to genocide, particularly former UN Ambassador Samantha Power's book, A Problem from Hell, he also plays a very powerful role in her work for good reason. So Lemkin was born in the kind of contemporary, at that time it was became the Soviet Union in the course of his life, and to a Jewish family. He was an avid reader from his own confession, and ended up being in law school in Lvov. He was considered a very brilliant law student. He had an excellent memory and had a lot of interesting and fascinating debates with his professors. And from a very young age, in his 20s, became concerned with the problem of mass violence. And he was actually one of a series of people beginning in the 1930s who were trying to figure out how to craft a new model for what the scholar Mark Lewis calls the international justice movement. This means kind of prior to the rise of Nazism, how and what form of rights are we going to develop and extend to people, and how do we get states to agree to that? Right. So this is the interwar period. And Lemkin wanted to expand a system that had existed in Europe previous to this called the minority rights system, which, if you don't know anything about the kind of late period of the rise of European nation states, each one of those states tried to figure out a way to secure the territorial rights for people that were not a part of that territory. And there were a series of negotiations that recognized the existence of what they called national groups, that were not in fact territorialized. And this system did not work out very well. There was a huge amount through the latter part of the 19th century of people being forced out, of disrespect for this rights. It was a legal regime that never really came together. But Lemkin believed that it had an important seed or kernel in it, which was that contemporary states carried out violence against people, not just as individuals, but because of who they were, because of their identity or the form of life that they were involved in, and that international law needed to potentially protect them. Well, it turns out that during the rise of fascist Europe, this idea was not going to carry much favor. Lemkin got withdrawn from these kind of legal discussions and circles. He had his own practice in Poland, which is where he ultimately settled, and was a really actually well-respected international lawyer until the Nazis invade. And he actually left on foot. And you can read the fragments of his autobiography, which have been put together by another brilliant scholar by the name of Donnelly Fries, in which he accounts running away with groups of people through the night in the woods, and ultimately using his multilingualism to gain access to the Soviet Union. And then through contacts, he actually ended up securing a post at Duke University in North Carolina. So he went on this sort of fantastic voyage across the Soviet Union by train to Japan by boat before it was at war with the United States, and then across the Pacific. And he actually lands in Seattle, Washington. And he says that of his entire transplanetary voyage, the most beautiful place that he arrived was Seattle, which means it must have been in the summer because he could see all the mountains and everything, and then goes by rail across to Duke. And there he is primarily supported in talking about theories of international law and discussing all of the important kinds of legal regulations that need to be created once the Nazis are defeated. And what's fascinating is that in doing that, in Duke, he actually catches the ear of a number of people who are thinking about what will happen after the Nazis are defeated by the Allies in Washington, D.C. And he starts to become a consultant. And his particular niche is because of his memory. He could tell how the Nazis had changed local legal regimes. He did that in a fantastic way, kind of like a photographic memory. And so he became a really important piece of evidence in a process that became the London conferences, which is where the great powers that were fighting the Axis all kind of decided on what kind of the structure the Nuremberg tribunals were going to have, what they were going to try to do in terms of parsing out Europe once it was occupied, making some of the military planning events, etc. So he's somebody that is being consulted, particularly with the Americans. And in this capacity, Lemkin actually comes up with the concept of genocide, because he sees it as an opportunity to once again revisit the problem that for the first time, in his view, states are no longer fighting wars with other states over traditional issues like sovereignty. They're now fighting wars against people, against whole minority groups. And what you're looking at now is actually the text of Chapter 9 of Axis, Rule, and Occupied Europe, which was commissioned by the Carnegie Commission, which is a volume that extensively documents all of the legal changes in Europe. But Lemkin inserted this concept to try to theoretically couch and describe what he thought the Nazis were doing. And it's interesting because this is published in 1943-44. So he had very incomplete knowledge of the Nazi genocide at that point in time. But he extensively documents that we need to be concerned for the destruction of nation and ethnic groups. He says that it is a colonial process. He outlines at least 7 or 8 different what he calls techniques of genocide that range from the kinds of physical violence, such as killing by force, that we're familiar with, to control of cultural institutions, libraries, languages, child theft, a whole manner of things, some of which we may or may not now associate with genocide, and then goes through in the rest of the text and says, here's how the Nazis have done this in each individual nation state, and here's how they've done it against various minority groups. Well, Lemkin is a pretty ardent advocate, and while he's being brought to the Nuremberg tribunals to help guide Telford Taylor and Robert Jackson, who are the American prosecutors, he's also advocating for the fact that the term genocide should be used in the actual indictment of the Nazis in the International Military Tribunal. He is unsuccessful in that. In fact, the Nuremberg charges that are pertinent to this kind of area of international law are what became crimes against humanity. But the language of genocide does actually start to appear at this particular period of the trial. But it's actually the British prosecutors, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe and Sir Hartley Shawcross, who start to describe and use the term genocide to kind of characterize the actions of the Nazis. And as I'm sure many of people in the audience here have been in a courtroom at one point or another, this has a kind of theatrical quality. They are, for the first time, sort of writing and making new international law. There's a performative aspect to what's going on. And so people pick up on this term. And what's kind of fascinating is this is only 3 or 4 years after the guy has created it. And so sometimes when I'm teaching this to my undergrads, I say it's a little bit like if your undergraduate paper started to become a major subject of international law only 3 years later, and you didn't have much time to revise because you were doing a whole lot of other ideas. And so what this term exactly means is actually very hard to kind of figure out. And one of the things that's really fascinating, though, is that it very quickly becomes noticed in presses worldwide. So this is actually a piece from 1946 from the New York Times, which sets up a series of interviews with Lemkin, where they're starting to document and describe what genocide is, and they're appropriating a lot of his own language, saying, this is a new phenomena, it's an international crime, we can be able to see that it has these distinctive techniques, it's different than war, it's different than just violating somebody's rights, etc. So what occurs is in 1946, the new UN votes for resolution in favor of creating a genocide convention, because the popularity of this language has meant that people believe we need to outlaw genocide for the first time. And that's a really important moment in Lemkin's life. He believes for the first time a new kind of international justice that actually robustly protects minority groups is going to be possible. Remember, this is after the defeat of the Axis powers, so there's maybe new opportunity. We're in kind of what sometimes characterizes the foundational moment for kind of modern international law. And Lemkin has had a lot of success in seeing his term get appropriated by lawmakers and politicians. And what ends up happening is that in the actual negotiations for the creation of what becomes the United Nations Genocide Convention, a lot of fairly problematic forces set to work for a number of different reasons. Some of them are very benign, and some of them are actually pretty problematic and arguably very racist, start to work against Lemkin's process. So at the United Nations, what happens actually is the Sixth Legal Committee, which is trying to set up new international laws, gets a mandate to try to draft the Genocide Convention. And remember, this is something that's only 3 or 4 years old at this point in time. So they have no idea how to do that. Like there's no previous document or precedent you can draw from this. They're starting from scratch. So they give it to the UN Secretariat and ask the Secretariat's office to create a draft. And the Secretariat does what we would probably all do. It turns to Lemkin and a couple of other famous figures in international law like Vespasian Pella, and they say, can you do this for us since you're the experts? And they generate what is called the Secretariat Draft of the Genocide Convention, which is actually too long to be able to show to you in any kind of abbreviated form, because it spelled out so many types of violence that could be considered constitutive of genocide. It ranged from things that we would now think of very easily and associate with the term to far-flung actions that we would rarely include in the term. And it talked about all kinds of different levels of a given political organization or a military group that might be complicit in genocide and therefore guilty under international law. Well, that comes back to the Sixth Legal Committee, and they say that's not going to fly. It's too broad, involves too much. If we actually had to accept this document, then virtually every state on the planet would be guilty of genocide in one form or another, because we all have these various issues with respect to the minority groups that are living within us. So instead, a second group takes a crack at developing the Genocide Convention called the Ad Hoc Committee. And this is a selection of the UN representatives, primarily the great powers, the United States, Soviet Union, France, Great Britain, China, etc., who start to try to work on the problem of what would be an acceptable version of the Genocide Convention. And Lemkin remains a consultant and somebody ongoing in these negotiations. But one thing that's kind of interesting is that in that committee, there are actually a lot of different ideas about what animates genocide. And a huge set of the interests are referencing the Nazi experience specifically, okay? From our contemporary standpoint, we have some really well-identified images and understandings of what happened in the Holocaust. But in 1946, the level of knowledge and the kind of specificity of the way that people were affected and the diversity of techniques the Nazis used to be able to kill Jews, Romas, and others was not as well understood. And actually, for Lemkin, it was not actually the originating event that he was thinking about when he was designing Genocide. That was actually the Armenian Genocide, which is something he had been reading about since he was a young man in law school in the 1920s. And so he actually wanted to pull away from the notion that genocide simply involved mass violence, concentration camps, to instead think about it as forced displacement, longer structural legacies of racism and oppression. And to some extent, he was not totally unsuccessful in advocating for this. So this, for instance, is one of the UN documents that's part of the Travaux Préparatoires. It's the series of archival materials that they have to kind of show us what the discussions were like. That, for instance, said that the ultimate definition of genocide should be based off a human group. That means any grouping of people, no matter how they can be identified, whatever intersection, if we're talking about race, if we're talking about gender, if we're talking about sexuality, if we're talking about nationality, religion, etc., might, for instance, be subject to genocide. There were discussions in the ad hoc tribunals about actually outlawing practices of narcotics distribution, outlawing practices of attacks on libraries or the defacement of cultural monuments. Things that we would perhaps not now so strongly associate with genocide because we've gotten a sort of image of it as mass killing, which I'm going to talk about more why we have that image of it now. This is actually a proposal by the United States, the document you're kind of glancing at, that was supportive of the Chinese representative who wanted a line included in the Genocide Convention targeting the acts of narcotic distribution under Imperial Japanese occupation. Pardon me, just to give you a sense of the breadth of things that were at stake here. So what ultimately happens? Well, this is the chapeau in the first two articles of the Genocide Convention. They are the most pertinent in terms of trying to define and identify what genocide is about. And there are some very significant changes in this document from almost all previous iterations of the Genocide Convention. For one, genocide ended up being defined by only 4 group categories: national, ethnical, racial, and religious. Second, there is a very strong emphasis on this document in intent, what's called dolo specialis, which means specific intent. It's a much higher prosecutorial standard for being able to actually charge somebody successfully with genocide. It requires you not only to have knowledge of the consequences of your actions, but to aim the consequences at the obliteration of a group of people. And then the list of acts are only 5. And while killing is the most central one, there are a few that are sort of lingering remnants of the much broader set of issues that Lemkin and others had laid on the table, such as forcibly transferring children of a group from one group to another. But notably and explicitly absent from this document was any discussion of cultural genocide. And any discussion of the social practices that might be put in jeopardy. In fact, Lemkin, when this document was created, said that the states in question had basically cut the heart out of the Genocide Convention and destroyed its soul. Alongside this version of the convention, there were a series of negotiations back and forth between the great powers who were all sensitive to what the Genocide Convention might entail for them, what kind of implications it might have. For instance, the Soviet Union had just gone through dekulakization in the previous 2 decades, and under Stalin had obviously been responsible for the deaths of millions of people. So it was concerned about any version of this that might implicate economic or political groups. It didn't want practices that would create mass famine or starvation to be a part of the document. France and Great Britain at this point in time are resurrecting their own empires and remain colonial powers, certainly in legal force for the next decade or so. And they're concerned about the treatment of their colonial contexts, right, and the way in which they manage and deal with minorities in those areas. Most people don't even know this, but for instance, there's the Sétif massacre in Algeria, which is still disputed in terms of how many people are killed in it, literally the day after the European theater comes to an end in World War II. So it's a very active issue. The United States obviously has its own anxieties about what would this mean with respect to the vexed and problematic legacy of indigenous people or the ongoing policies of Jim Crow segregation, Or even there's some specific concern about the historical relationship in Chinese exclusion that are sometimes brought up in this context. So all of these states are wary of this document because it might call into question their own problematic practices. And as such, there's an effort to bargain it down so that there's an acceptance of it. But this victory is largely symbolic. It is not intended to be a document that can in any significant way be used or applied to states after it's created. And so one of the things that's kind of fascinating is it's a laudable achievement in international law that this is created. But if you read an activist like Lemkin, who is through this process the entire time, he views this as a crushing defeat because it doesn't supply the mechanisms to actually respond to the types of violence that he is concerned about. And in many ways, he would later argue until his death in the late 1950s, actually enable those states to remain complicit with those forms of violence. So was this a legitimate concern? Was he right about that particular issue? I actually will argue that he was in a very significant way, because it's actually, when it comes to the United States to potentially ratify this, it's exactly these kinds of concerns defending racist legacies, which are the reason why the Genocide Convention is rejected. So this is actually testified before the Senate's Foreign Affairs Subcommittee that is responsible for reviewing the document, that is responding to the American Bar Association, which had brought concerns that the Genocide Convention would outlaw the practice of lynching as a component of racial segregation, which implies that the American sovereignty that would be jeopardized by this and potentially challenged under international law is a form of racial terror that we would now recognize as being a horrendous action, right? Those were the arguments against this. There are potentially a whole series of comments and quotations we could draw out from lawmakers that are made about this point in time that link the essentially desire to continue racist policies within the United States to the need to reject the Genocide Convention. In fact, I would go so far as to say that while somebody like Samantha Power in her work maintains that it is sovereignty that states were concerned about, what the reasons for defending sovereignty in that instance, because in international law, you're always potentially like losing some degree of sovereignty, what those reasons were ultimately about were in fact the maintenance of our own kind of racist institutions. Things like reservations for indigenous people and formal segregation. And actually that was explicitly brought up in the context of American history by a group called the Civil Rights Congress, which is not a well-known part of the history of the struggle against racism, but is a really important one. So the Civil Rights Congress was both an anti-racism organization and a nominally communist organization. And they created a petition in 1951 called We Charge Genocide. That was a meticulous document, and that's actually meticulous comes from a Justice Department note and review of that. That's not my own words. That basically showed how extensively the practices of slavery and segregation contributed to the genocide of what the document at that time obviously terms Negro people. We now use the terms African American or Black, clearly. And it was so extensive that it had hundreds of cases to demonstrate its point. It cited both legal and extra-legal practices, and it formally asked the United Nations, even though the United States had not ratified the Genocide Convention, to potentially be charged or have charges of genocide brought against it by other states. And the response of the United States at this point in time to this petition is actually fairly vicious. There's an effort to get the NAACP to bash the organization. Major figures like Walter White are kind of counseled to potentially come out against it. William L. Patterson, who's one of the major figures that delivers the petition, has his passport revoked and is kind of followed around Europe by US agents to ensure it doesn't arrive, possibly because the claim that the Genocide Convention could apply in this context was one of such palpable anxiety, and partly because if you do a plain text reading of aspects of it in comparison with some of these practices, it's very obvious that at least there's an open question if this is in fact a case of genocide. So these kinds of movements, in many sense, crush the possibility of the great powers accepting and giving meaningful force to the Genocide Convention. And one of the things, if we looked at when and how do different states end up accepting the Genocide Convention and then how they execute the Genocide Convention. Execution is when you create domestic legislation that aligns your existing laws with the international law that you create. There are always a series of what are called reservations and understandings that limit the scope of that particular treaty. And in most cases, those limitations have meant that the Genocide Convention is, if not a dead article of law, one that is exceptionally, exceptionally hard to apply, and certainly a far cry from what Lemkin and the people who were originally envisioning this particular body of international law wanted, where they wanted a much more robust system of protections for minorities within states. In the United States context, for instance, we don't ultimately ratify the Genocide Convention until the Reagan administration, in fact, his second term, which would give you a sense of how extensive the gap is, right? This is sort of the part I'm going to conclude on the founding moment. I know I've spent a lot of time talking about it, but it's really important. Question becomes, why then do we talk about genocide so much if it is kind of a dead article of law? And the answer has to do with what was going on in the 1970s. Remember that second blip? And there's actually kind of two parallel pieces. And I'm going to go a little bit quicker through this part of the history, so I'm happy to answer it in the Q&A. But in the 1970s, we actually see the term genocide begin to pop up and references to the Genocide Convention in two interesting places. In left criticism of imperial and colonial warfare, and in right criticism of totalitarian and authoritarian states. So what you're looking at now is an image drawn from the Russell Tribunal, which was the tribunal that held the United States, not in any formal setting, but in an impromptu trial, guilty for war crimes and crimes of genocide in Vietnam, that used that term and it tried to apply the law to create some kind of social mobility and protest to the ongoing presence of the US in Vietnam. You'll also see that term appear in reference to books like the Gulag Archipelago, which are some of the first opportunities that Western audiences actually have to hear a great deal about the events and violence that had been ongoing in the Soviet Union. Parallel appearances occur in this reference to the Cultural Revolution. And what I argue actually happens here is it's the very rarity of the uses of genocide to describe any event other than Nazism, and the fact that there is no historical precedent for the application of this international law in the 1950s or the 1960s. That then means when a sort of new generation of people are looking at what are the moral standards we can appeal to, they say, well, genocide must be the sort of rarest and most evil form of international law or international crime. And so that's what characterizes these tremendously horrible events. And at this parallel period, we actually become interested in human rights in a new way. There's actually a Harvard historian, Samuel Moyn, who's gotten a lot of credit for arguing that the term human rights as a way of understanding injustices in global affairs doesn't really begin until the late 1970s. And I tend to believe he's correct about this. There are a lot of events in this period that start to promote the idea of human rights for the first time. We see it in Soviet dissidents that are protesting limits on their freedom. We see it in Jimmy Carter's inaugural address. It had been 30 years since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed by the United Nations, in the same window that the Genocide Convention is passed. And there's actually conferences that designate and kind of remark on this event. And Moyn argues that the reason we use human rights is because a lot of our other kind of grand political visions for how to achieve equity and justice for people have at the very least been called into question. So decolonialism, for instance, didn't result in the kinds of emancipation and promise it wanted to. The equity-seeking parts of the communist experiment ended up leading to authoritarianism and corruption. Liberal democracy after Nixon seemed to be a situation where instead we were dealing with morally corrupt leaders rather than people that were trying to kind of give and bestow the benefits of democracy and capitalism to everybody. And so human rights for him promises a sort of minimal moral vision of the world that is a little bit empty in its content. It doesn't specify so much beyond human beings should not have to suffer unnecessarily, and allows lots of different constituencies to appeal to it and begin to resonate. And what I argue in parallel with that is that this is part of why genocide starts to appear as the pinnacle crime. Because in this moment, if you read letters from activists and organizations, what their understanding of the Genocide Convention is as sort of the pinnacle or ultimate crime above all others, followed by crimes against humanity, and then a variety of human rights violations. And that is an ahistorical understanding of what genocide means. Lemkin, if we go back to that 1940s period, was actually an open critic and hostile to the idea of human rights. He thought that it was a misunderstanding of the way in which states and regimes were carrying out violence because they were not doing it based off an individual in their individual capacity, right? Like the rights of habeas corpus that I have as a result of my body, but against the type of person that I am, right? Whether or not I'm a Jewish person or a person with disabilities or what have you. And so he actually thought that it was going to create a weaker model of international law where states would potentially say, well, that's not quite a worse enough situation for us to have to do something more significant to morally commit to an intervention. And what I hate to say a little bit is that criticism has, to some extent, I think, bared fruit, because in many ways, the way we continue to talk about genocide is it is the rarest events. It is always preceded by a series of human rights violations that are at some level tolerable to states, but then never become actionable. And then once we agree or achieve a consensus that genocide is a problem and is ongoing, it becomes almost too late for states to feel like they need to dedicate resources to it. So Lemkin was calling for an agenda in international law that was far more aggressive and in a certain sense preemptive in dealing with global problems than the one that emerges alongside the human rights movement. And in the 1970s or 80s kind of changed our understanding of what genocide means. And in many ways, we now are inheritors of this legacy, right? When we talk about protests and call attention to genocide, when we engage in genocide recognition efforts, such as the example here, which is people protesting the ongoing treatment of the Uyghurs in West China, or in West China. The way in which they use the term of genocide is one that signifies that it is symbolically stilling. It is the worst possible crime that we can envision, and so it's one that demands our attention. But what they don't recognize is that the only, as activists at that time, and they're not supposed to recognize this, right, is that the reasons why it's so rarefied have to do with the fact that the international mechanisms to be able to indict people and to deter this type of crime were in a certain sense sabotaged from the get-go in order to be able to preserve the power structures and hierarchies within the states that were signing on to it, right? And so in many ways, that what we call the condition of possibility for their protest is actually the undermining of the very law that they're appealing to in some ways. And it's sort of this tragedy because we have a legal system on the books that is very hard to in some ways apply, and then in some sense misunderstands the fact that international law only operates if there's also substantial political will. So I'm going to give you just a few other examples of the way in which this becomes problematic in contemporary settings and why sometimes the appeal to the language of genocide does not have the kind of robust effects that we're hoping for. I argue, and this is my own research here entering into, that there are 4 different ways in which we kind of use or decide that an event of violence doesn't qualify as genocide, or if it does qualify as genocide, it's only after we've seen extreme versions of all of these. And the 4 kind of qualifiers are whether or not the group is a potential subject of genocide, whether or not it's a significant enough part of a group that is subjected to genocide, what kinds of destruction or violence we see, and then what are the desires or intentions of the people that are carrying out those forms of mass violence. And I'm just going to give you a few examples of cases that if you were really like a very close, a person that was attending all kinds of global political discussions, you might find where there's some discussion, is this a genocide? And the answer is robustly no, but the outcomes are actually really startling. So for instance, this is an image of the Basarwa, which are a nomadic people that lived in the Central Kalahari Game Reserve, a very small population. And because of the discovery of kimberlite deposits there in the mid-1990s, they were forcibly relocated by the state of Botswana, which is Swanan, that's the dominant ethnic group there. And they're put in a settlement called Nuzade, and taken out of their lands, which they have constitutionally protected rights to since the creation of the state of Botswana in 1961. And what ended up happening is a lot of people died as a result of that forced relocation. They lost access to water. Some kids were put into forced re-education situations. There was in some ways a series of tandem attacks from various kinds of militias that were either sponsored by corporate interests or prospectors or the state. And this group almost entirely disappeared over the next decade, in spite of the fact that the Supreme Court of Botswana and the High Court of Botswana both ruled in their favor that their rights had been violated. And in some ways, this is all happening in the early 2000s, this seems like a kind of textbook case of genocide. The difficulty is that the group in question isn't the kind of ethnic and racial group that we tend to associate with either nationalism or any of those terms, right? The conflict itself and the group boundaries are just not the same because the bodies are itinerant, because the social practices don't look like what journalists are accustomed to describing. And so in some ways, there's a problem of ascription because we can't end up viewing this group as subject to violence in the same way as other ongoing genocides, and also because of the size of the group, right? That there are not enough people to potentially feel like the Genocide Convention is applicable in this case, particularly because this was occurring at the same time that some of the Congo wars were ongoing, where millions of people lost their lives, and the UN has now said there are crimes against humanity there, and the ongoing violence in Darfur, which I'm probably sure everyone in the room has heard about at this point in time. But it's one of these examples where there's kind of a limit category where a group that actually probably robust intervention could have assisted in serious ways never appears in part of the dialogue around genocide. We could talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, which attempted to address the issue of residential schools, which had been used to the phrase that Andrew Wolford uses that's kind of troubling for this is to kill the native in the child. In the history of both the US practice, but then Canada, these were extended into the 1970s and even 1980s. This was a documentary process that tried to show what had happened to all the peoples that were part of First Nations and that had been part of this. It documents all kinds of abuse, scandals, there are murders, there are efforts to teach people not to be part of their culture, to destroy language, etc. But, and here's the catch, the document was created with only the intent of looking at a part of that mass violence, which was the school system itself. It didn't extend beyond that or consider any other elements of the history of First Nations in Canada, which means that when it ultimately determines that cultural genocide had in fact taken place in Canada, that is a symbolic action, because when Canada executed the Genocide Convention, when it made it part of their laws, they said no part of cultural genocide will be an element of Canadian law, which means that the Canadian state has weirdly said, yes, we committed genocide against you, First Nations, but we're only going to document and apologize for the parts of it that we can't be held materially or legally culpable for. And so in some ways, the action undermines maybe more robust claims that might be made on behalf of First Nations with respect to rights, land use, etc. Right? Selection of a part of genocide that we can deal with palpably. Sometimes we think about genocide as concentration camps and mass killing, but there are lots of other techniques of genocide that sometimes go unnoticed. For instance, Andrew Basso, who's a brilliant scholar from Ottawa, has demonstrated that forced displacement, often though, even though people don't say it explicitly that they intend it to destroy a group, they call it ethnic cleansing, right, which just means forcibly removing people, has the effect of essentially annihilating people because of all of the types of exposure that people are subjected to. And so often what are considered sort of low-level techniques of mass violence, when we think about and hear about it in the news media, are actually probably constitutive of genocide under international law. But because of our association with events like the Holocaust, it makes it hard for us to understand that these are part of the process, and thus we don't respond to them as quickly. There are also even discussions about whether or not intention is necessary to commit an act of genocide. This is actually a document that came from a news article about a Brazilian NGO's indictment of the United Nations itself for what it called the negligent genocide in the case of Haiti. You remember in 2010, there was the earthquake there, and then there was a cholera epidemic. That cholera epidemic was a result of UN peacekeepers who were not sufficiently screened, bringing in a particular biotype of the infection. This Brazilian group actually brought the United Nations on charges before the Inter-American Court of Rights and made the case that you could have a negligent genocide. And disputes the question of intention. Now, we could get into a lot of details of this particular case, but it shows that what kinds of intentions people have are part of what helps us think about genocide and make it more visible. And in fact, in each one of these categories, there are a very limited set of institutions and norms that we have in our kind of thought process, our construction of the problem of genocide. And as a result, even though we have new institutions like the International Criminal Court, they offer such a narrow reading of genocide, even though they now have the power to prosecute in something like 117 countries, theoretically. And their resources are so limited because of the structural commitments that were made and affected by the decisions in the 1940s, that in some sense, there is very little possibility for them to have the kind of deterrent effect that they're intended to. Or if we look at another kind of new area of atrocity prevention, like a hybrid court, this is from the extraordinary chambers of the courts of Cambodia, right, which is who's on trial here is Nuon Chea, who's brother number 2. He is afforded his ability to speak in this event. And the idea was that by affording both perpetrators, bystanders, and witnesses the ability to be a part of a court process, what would end up happening was major charges that would help Cambodian society to overcome some of the divisiveness and issues that had followed from the genocide years beforehand. But in fact, even the charges of genocide in this context were hard to get to stick, because once lawyers were able to take the terms from the convention and say, well, hold on, you didn't really use this particular understanding of nationality, or the groups you were talking about were too diffuse for you to actually be committed with a charge of genocide. Those kinds of arguments were actually almost impossible to make against anybody except just a few members of the Khmer Rouge, including Nuon Chea, where those claims were not successfully made. We obviously have an interesting and unprecedented case now with the Gambia taking up Myanmar in the ICJ. But what's fascinating is very prominent figures within the genocide studies community, such as Dr. William Shabas, who's a brilliant thinker and wrote the book Genocide in International Law, which provides perhaps the most extensive reading of the case law, has actually gone to the defense of Myanmar by saying that it's inapplicable under the high standard that's required of the Genocide Convention. And so I actually have some doubt whether or not Gambia's case, despite all of the available evidence, will actually be successful in the end of the day. And again, that's because of the weakness of the legal regime that was crafted deliberately, and then because of the effect that had on the way we socially understand and relate to what the problem of genocide is. There are other experiments to try to solve this. The Obama administration created, for instance, the Atrocity Prevention Board in 2012, I want to say, which is a new kind of joint effort across the State Department and DOD and other places that try to get information and craft strategy for how the United States would respond to a situation of mass violence. But in those occasions, most of what they end up doing is, in a certain sense, miming doctrines that were present in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq for population-centric warfare, for trying to guide and focus on hearts and minds. And they don't have any sense that international law gives the ability to preemptively and robustly have one state intervene in another. In fact, there are essentially no historical precedents of humanitarian interventions in that way happening to stop an ongoing genocide. There's some dispute about cases like the French invasion under the R2P in Mali, et cetera, that we could talk about if you wanted to. But it's not just that states are self-interested and nationalistic, and that's the reason they don't do this. In many occasions, they don't feel like the actual legal basis for their intervention is sufficient and robust. We have, as a consequence, a whole variety of situations across the globe, which this is from Genocide Watch, which is a popular NGO, and Greg Stanton's 8 or 10 Phases of Genocide is one of the most kind of prominent models that we have of understanding the causal dynamics, where there are situations of mass violence. Almost all of these involve a variety of different targets. They involve different kinds of social groups, since the human community exists in enormous diversity in terms of our identities. They involve different degrees of historical legacy, power, equity, elitism, economic injustice, racial injustice, etc. They are at, according to Genocide Watch, different stages. Almost all of these episodes would be covered under the version of genocide that Raphael Lemkin originally advocated and wanted to craft a robust international regime in order to be able to prevent. Instead, what's occurred is that international law has been made to be so brittle and rarefied that it's hard to ever leverage it. And so instead of having regular legal applications of the term, we have a very broad, very diverse set of social discourses calling for political change against what are predominantly mass violent episodes that involve mass killing. And in some ways, that has that kind of protest inherits the fact that we have this international law in order to maintain long-standing forms of structural racism and structural oppression. And it is, in certain sense, hamstrung from the get-go at being able to make inroads in the wide variety of different places in which we have mass violence on the planet today, because the resources have never been made available to be able to address the problem in a serious way, because we understand genocide now as essentially a rarefied rather than an everyday event. And the consequence of that is that we, in some ways, have missed the boat on having a much, much broader, more socially justice oriented, and more powerful regime of international law. So I'll end there.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Ben. So I'll remind people, if you want to ask Ben questions, use the chat room to do so. We don't quite have questions in the chat room, Ben, but I guess your presentation begs the question of our country. Given everything you said, what is the opinion of the genocide scholar community about the displacement of Indigenous Americans by white Europeans?
I would say that there are, like any intellectual community or epistemic community, there are always going to be people who have some form of disagreement. But I think that the majority of genocide scholars would argue that if the interaction with Indigenous peoples, and we're talking about separate historical events here, right, and distinct peoples, but a lot of those were likely and easily classifiable as cases of genocide, or certainly involved elements and acts of genocide. There are obviously, and in fact, I taught this morning colonial genocide to my students in class, so we had a big, long discussion about this, right? There's a lot of different points where we could discuss that, right? And problems with what do we mean by intent and how do we establish that? But just to give you a sense, consensus is between 1492 and 1700 that around 54 million people in the Americas, for instance, died. Most of them as a result of infectious disease spread, which was probably not deliberate, right? Because the idea of a microbial biome didn't exist in that phase. But that doesn't mean that people didn't view it in theological terms as a result of the vindication of a certain model of Christianity, and so feel like it was on their side and that was something that they were not going to help or try to prevent. And that as a consequence of those kinds of exposures, societies that depended a lot on robust agricultural systems all collapsed, right? Now, whether or not those events constitute genocide is probably a more disputable question, although there are certainly scholars who will say that they do. What we typically refer to as the American Indian Wars, however, right, which is the period in the 19th century where the westward expansion of the US occurs, probably does involve multiple episodes of fairly well-documented genocide, even some that are often explained or narrated as armed conflict. So for instance, the Modoc, who are people that historically live in what's now Northern California or Southern Oregon, are understood as fighting against colonists and are often depicted in tribunals and journalists and periodicals and stuff like that as sort of the classic bloodthirsty savage, the racist caricature, but definitely were explicitly and targeted for elimination by the state of California and by the nascent state of the Oregon Territory. So there are certainly cases of that. I'm actually originally from Minnesota, and Minnesota had on its books a reward for the scalping of Indigenous peoples for much of its early history. And I can't remember what the exact dollar amount was, but it's a pretty significant amount of money. So it's hard to separate those policies from the effort to forcibly eliminate Indigenous life. That's what I would say. And I'm certainly in that camp. I think that the absence of a robust response to the predicament facing Indigenous peoples is probably in some ways the easiest place for folks situated within the United States to try to have a meaningful impact and exercise some agency and power in addressing a problem of legacy around genocide. So I hope that's a long-winded explanation or response with a lot, I know, and this is everything in here is contested, potentially and contestable, but that's where I come from on this. I saw a question from John Gray in the chat. Can I expand on the right to protect? I think what you're referencing was a comment I made just a second ago towards the end of the presentation about Mali and France and a doctrine that's called the responsibility to protect. So in 2001, a group called, I forget the acronym because it's so long, the International Committee on State Sovereignty and Intervention wrote a new doctrine called the responsibility to protect that said the basis of state sovereignty is not in a legal right to rule, kind of like absolute power over your territory, but about the state's capacity to care for the welfare of its citizens. And the doctrine suggested that if states could not do that, either because they were failed states and couldn't provide resources to their people, or because the state had become predatory with respect to some aspect of its population, that the international community could treat it as no longer having sovereign control. And as a result, legitimately justify intervention if that state was a member of the UN Charter, which is where they derived the principles from. And it outlined a whole series of mechanisms to both protect, to try to support societies before they got to those periods, and to then facilitate restitution if there were episodes of mass violence or state failure. In 2005, the United Nations passed a version of that in what's called the World Summit Outcome Process, and made it in a 2-paragraph form a part of their doctrine. And it has been invoked in a few occasions to try to justify humanitarian interventions. The French case in Mali is one example of that. The NATO effort to oust Gaddafi in Libya also was under the auspices of the responsibility to protect doctrine. There are a few other occasions. There's been a lot of discussion, for instance, why wasn't it used in Syria when it was potentially very applicable in that situation, or Yemen when there's plenty of issues there. The truth is that in many respects, there's a lot of uncertainty over how that doctrine can be applied, who gets to apply it, or if there are sort of domestic political interests and self-interests that are guiding its application. So it's not been a particularly successful model moving forward, is the truth.
So we have a question from Senator Fraser. She says, I've read that Nazi policies against the Jews were modeled after US policies against African Americans. Do you have any comments?
That is absolutely the case. Also modeled off US policies towards indigenous people. And the Nazis sent folks to try to model and figure out what was going on with US practice in segregation in the South. And they actually went explicitly to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in order to try to figure out how the reservation system was being managed. And there are any number of scholars who have shown comments from high Nazi officials, including Hitler, trying to describe how to set up essentially an American version of the racist experiment in the construction of Nazi Germany. So it is not just like a casual link, there is a direct link there. There's actually a lot of forebears and elements of preceding colonial history that are folded into the rise of Nazism, to the extent that some folks don't recognize or know that. Another important example, for instance, is the case of the Herero and Nama in German Southwest Africa. So I don't know how familiar people are with world history, right? In the late 19th century, we have this sort of industrial phase of colonialism. Germany gets a territory that is in contemporary Namibia, and there is robust fighting against the German presence and colonization presence there. And a general is sent named Lothar von Trotha, who designs a strategy that involves essentially winning a series of skirmishes with the Herero and forcing them into a desert, and then which is the Omataki or the Kalahari Desert. And then he figures out, well, hold on, I don't actually have to end up using my soldiers to go out and hunt people down if I can just create a giant wall around the desert so that people will slowly die over time as a result of environmental exposures and exposures to different kinds of chemicals. It's true that that is perhaps the first example of an effort to use environmental and what's sometimes referred to as atmospheric engineering as a technique to destroy large groups of people. And some of this very racist tropes that we find in the Holocaust are reiterated in form there against who the Herero were, and then the Nama, which is a separate, smaller group. But it's probably the first episode of wide-scale colonial violence undertaken by the German Empire. And many of the people who later become sort of the grandfathers, if you will, of Nazism are folks who had at least some exposure or knowledge of that event. There's also an interesting conversation if we want to talk about other ways in which all of this is interconnected historically. There's a brilliant scholar by the name of Stephen Ihrig who's written a book called Justifying Genocide. I actually have it on the shelf behind me. I could try to pull it out for you and show it to you if you wanted, in which he shows that the German populace was aware of the treatment of the Armenians, right, which was before we had the language of genocide to describe what was happening, and that there was actually a large kind of popular movement to explain and rationalize that as a legitimate action at the time it was ongoing in the 1910s, but then resurfaces with some of the same writers appearing in the Nazi period. So one of the fascinating things is we kind of get these feedback loops between experiences of mass violence that foment one another and that reference one another in really problematic ways.
So the next question we have is, to prove genocide, must all 4 criteria be met? Given the narrow focus of the definition of genocide, have any countries or regimes been convicted of genocide? Yes, the Nazis, but what about in recent history?
So regimes per se or countries, no. Individual leaders, yes. And there are a few different examples of that. There are convictions at the International Tribunal for Rwanda and the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which are what's called the ad hoc tribunals. And they were both in the mid-90s following the period of violence there, and the ICTY extends for decades after that. And they both involve charges of genocide and are some of the places where the litigation and trying to determine exactly what the Genocide Convention means are most well spelled out. Because remember, this gets passed in 48, right, by the United Nations. There is a gap of 45 years before it starts to be applied in any legal context in a meaningful and significant way. So folks are essentially kind of inventing on the go with, you saw that document. It's not a lot to go with in terms of trying to unpack what these terms mean. And there have been only a handful of convictions in those contexts. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, which was created in 2001, after the agreement on the Rome Statute, has also successfully made prosecution of genocide and made charges of genocide in a few cases. But in almost all of both their prosecutions and their successful convictions, it has been against leaders of former African states like the DRC or Sierra Leone that are in a position where the international community can easily bring them to bear, which means that any more powerful state that commits acts of violence don't have to ever kind of face scrutiny for those kinds of charges, which means that is a very partial application of these rules, is what I would say.
And then there's a question from Courtney Nevitt. Can you comment on the 10 stages of genocide?
What are the 10 stages of genocide? Is that what you're curious about? Or
yes.
I'm trying to remember them off the top of my hat. Your question me. So the final stage in stage 10 is denial, and before that is extermination. Then there's a series that he describes as like persecution, oppression. I might actually have some of them here if I just click out there. I'm not sharing screen with you anymore. And then there are low-level things like otherization, dehumanization of a victim group, dispossession of rights, etc. Stanton's model is designed to help us operationalize the model of genocide for social observation, right? So when we're just kind of describing and thinking about and interacting with the world around us, and he wants to try to argue that those phases or those stages are not mutually exclusive, and that just because some of the latter ones are the most kind of dangerous in terms of the loss of life, that we as informed global citizens should be concerned about basically all of them. That they're all potential signatories. And so if you look at that map that I had up a minute ago, I'll see if I can find it and put it up again. You'll note that a huge portion of the world on this, can I share screen again with you, is actually at some stage in their model of genocide, including states that are in some degree of active denial of it. And the countries in Europe certainly have a history of that, but they would not claim that, for instance, there's denial of the Nazi genocide in Europe by those particular states, because places like Germany and Poland have created some very formal mechanisms to acknowledge that. So it's a large area of the world that we need to be concerned about potentially.
So another question is, in the opinion of the majority of genocide scholars, do the Chinese actions against the Uyghurs amount to genocide?
Again, I like I said in the previous question, there's dispute amongst genocide scholars. Some genocide scholars will hold a very narrow interpretation of what genocide means, and they'll wait to hear the evidence in a more like formalized setting before they'll make any kind of determination about that. Others are much more open to trying to deploy genocide studies in a kind of activist vein, and to think about trying to make social protests stronger on the basis of that. I would say if we were to poll them, that probably the majority would be at the very most concerned, if not in agreement, that there's definitely a case of genocide there, because of the things like the forced sterilization, control of reproduction, which are explicitly criminalized by the Genocide Convention. One of the problems with developing an international legal regime and then saying you have to have such a particular notion of the intent behind it, where you understand the consequence of your actions and we can prove that those were the desired outcome that you had, that you really wanted to destroy X group because of its religiosity, is it creates space for the political leaders of states to disseminate contradictory statements about what they're actually interested in, and as a consequence kind of dissuade themselves or separate themselves from legal culpability. I think we've actually potentially seen some version of that kind of invocation and a dissonance in our own political experience in the past several years. Maybe not to that set of extremes, obviously, but it means that there's a lot of opportunity to manipulate existing international law so as to reduce the likelihood of any kind of formal genocide charge being made. In the context of something like the People's Republic of China, there's also the major issue, which my friends in international relations, who are realists and kind of look at the world, would say, well, that also requires a political force and a war in order to be successful. And as a matter of fact, in the negotiations at the United Nations, Sir Hartley Shawcross, who was the UN representative at the discussions around the Genocide Convention, as much as he was a prosecutor, said, that one of the problems with this law is it's going to commit us to have to go to war with one another in order to potentially stop mass violence. And in some ways, the reluctance to do that in a global age is part of the reason why it's hard, except through domestic protests and action, to get these states to acknowledge either their ongoing forms of violence or their historical episodes of violence.
And I think we have just one last question for you, Ben. I'm very pleased that you made it all the way to the end without losing your voice. So here's one last question for you before we close for the evening. Which organizations or individuals are trying to strengthen the application of the international genocide law? Is anyone trying to improve the application of the law?
So I would say that the existence of the responsibility to protect, the existence of the International Criminal Court are all examples of efforts that have been going on for some time, since the 1990s, since this kind of increase in consciousness around this issue developed, to make that more practical. And what we're discovering is that it is really hard to envision a world with which states cooperate on these issues, even though there is tacit agreement that this is a moral catastrophe. Okay, and that's, for somebody who studies international relations, again, that's not surprising. States are not all that inclined all the time to cooperate with one another, especially when they have to dedicate resources and pieces to it. So sometimes when I'm teaching students about international organizations, I say, look, if you examine the past 200 years, right, when most of contemporary international law is kind of worked out, there are very few examples of anything even remotely like the precedents we're seeing now. Okay, if you go to 1915, you will find a condemnation of the Sublime Porte, which was the diplomatic name for the Ottoman Empire, for its treatment of the Armenians for crimes against humanity, which is one of the first times we ever find that. But it's a one-line little telegram that got sent that then never led to any meaningful political action against anybody. Okay. In contrast, where there are, for the first time now, some institutions that can try to meet a version of international justice, which means at least there's a framework for a conversation to take place, and that's a starting point. There are definitely advocates. There are social organizations and activist groups that, like Stanton's, that try to protest genocide. There are all kinds of specific organizations. I've consulted with a couple of student organizations that are nationwide around specific experiences of mass violence that they are trying to challenge. There are political officials like Samantha Power that are trying to expand the resources and tools here. And I think that all of that can be really great. There are dangers and problems that come with expansion of those responses too. There's a lot of unintended consequences. Unintended consequences are legion in international politics. But one of the problems that I end up having, as somebody who knows a lot about the history of this legal concept, is that even that version of an anti-genocide politics, one that tries to stamp out and prevent genocide, ends up starting from a premise about how and where we generate mass violence from, that ignores a lot of the underlying dynamics that kind of bubble away until they boil over, that really were at the heart of what this law was supposed to be about in the 1940s. And so in a certain way, even the strongest efforts now have given up the ghost in terms of the broad model of international justice that this entire endeavor was really about in the 1940s. And part of what's so remarkable about this for me as a scholar of history is that all of this has happened in basically the past 75 or 80 years. So there's all of these sort of abrupt changes of heart. I hope that answers the question. I noticed also that Courtney chimed back in to ask how the 10 stages, Stanton's 10 stages relate to the prosecution of genocide. They actually don't relate to it. They're just a way for people to try to garner a richer kind of understanding that there's a lot of complex levels and elements here. They're not invoked in the context of prosecution. Only that kind of narrow definition from the United Nations is. So it's much more limited.
It sounds like we may end up revisiting this topic. Wow, thank you very much, Ben. This was pretty fascinating and timely ending to the evening. I do want to just say to everybody, though I previously said to you that this concludes our program for this program year, OWAC has actually been in negotiations with Congressmember Marilyn Strickland's office, and we believe that she will be joining us for a special program late next month. So we will be in touch with you when we have final details on putting that together, and we hope that you will all be able to join us for that. Ben, I think everybody participating tonight is joining me in thanking you very much. This was thought-provoking. Thank you, and thanks everybody for coming, and hope to see you next month. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ben. Terrific work. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate the opportunity again.
We'll talk again soon. Thanks, Ben.